Hello and welcome to True Heroes. In today's video, the racism in Brazil is deeply embedded in its historical roots. From colonization and the transatlantic slave trade to the formation of a society deeply divided by class and race, we delve into the key historical events and decisions that have contributed to racial issues and how understanding this history can offer insight into present-day struggles for equality. Brazil, a country known for its stunning landscapes, rich culture, and vibrant history. But beyond the captivating sights lies a darker, more complicated narrative, one deeply intertwined with racism and inequality. To understand racism in Brazil today, we must look back at its historical roots and confront the legacy that continues to shape the nation's social structure. In 1500, Portuguese colonizers arrived on the shores of what is now Brazil, marking the beginning of a long, brutal history of exploitation and oppression. Over the next centuries, millions of African slaves were forcibly brought to Brazil in what became the largest slave trade operation in history. Brazil received about 40% of all enslaved Africans, far more than any other country in the Americas. The Portuguese colonizers built their wealth on the backs of these enslaved people, establishing large plantations for sugar, coffee, and other cash crops. The institution of slavery was not only an economic engine but also a tool of control, deeply entrenching a racial hierarchy that would persist for centuries. As Brazil's economy grew, so did its dependence on slave labor. By the 19th century, slavery had become so entrenched in Brazilian society that its abolition in 1888, the last country in the Americas to do so, left the country grappling with deep-seated racial and social divisions. When slavery was finally abolished in Brazil, nearly 4 million Africans and their descendants were left with no land, no resources, and no support from the government. The freed slaves were expected to integrate into a society that had long viewed them as inferior. Many migrated to urban areas, forming the early favelas, informal settlements that are still symbolic of poverty and racial inequality in Brazil today. Despite these challenges, a narrative of racial democracy began to take hold in Brazil in the early 20th century. This idea, promoted by intellectuals and politicians, claimed that Brazil was a racially harmonious society, free from the racial divisions that plagued other nations, particularly the United States. However, the myth of racial democracy masked the reality of systemic racism and inequality. Afro-Brazilians continued to face widespread discrimination in housing, employment, and education, while lighter-skinned Brazilians were afforded more opportunities. The narrative of racial democracy allowed many to ignore the racial inequalities deeply ingrained in Brazilian society.